But would you suggest baselining in the initial stages of dating someone?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I spent a lot of time looking into. Are only going to give that story right when you get to that story. That is information that's on the front of your mind.
A deception detection expert be really good at lying.
Oh, yeah. No.
Why? The IQ is just way too high?
Something, I hear it, and then I'm like, and then I want to go back and say it the right way, but I'm like, no, that would look even more suspicious.
We're now going to go over some of the questions that Sergio got in his comments in his first video. And if you're wondering why we look different, it's because we're filming on a different day. Sergio is going to answer them, and I might answer some as well, or add some additional questions or comments or whatever. Ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. The first question, Flute Girl asked, and a few others asked this question actually. How does this type of analysis adapt when dealing with low or no empathy people who have no problem lying? Essentially sociopaths. A couple people asked specifically about sociopaths.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that was something that I spent a lot of time looking into. And I specifically was watching Netflix documentaries about Ted Bundy and other sociopaths to try and see if their linguistics and their verbiage would change. Because like in those documentaries, they'll talk about their personal interests and stuff like that. So I was trying to baseline them. The first thing that I noticed is the lack of empathy really only applies to the victims. Ted Bundy didn't want to get caught. He was a narcissist, and so he did a lot of things that undermined his own case. But it wasn't because he wasn't afraid of getting caught. It was because he was a narcissist, and he literally thought that no matter what he did, he would outsmart the system. But you see in his language the same indicators that you see in everybody else's language. When he, especially in the beginning of that documentary, he is not admitting to the crimes right away. And so the long story short here is that empathy doesn't actually impact your verbiage. The reason why people use indicators, it's not because they feel bad for lying to you. It's because your brain is literally not wired to lie, because it's a subconscious part of your brain that chooses the words. And so it creates friction in your brain. The Broca section that I mentioned a lot, that part of your brain doesn't understand what your prefrontal cortex is doing. It doesn't understand why you're changing those words. It just keeps sending the signal that that's the wrong word. And so it creates an internal stress and internal friction. But it's not the lack of empathy that creates those indicators.
That's super interesting. So it's kind of like, it's almost like your brain is like water in that situation. Or at least your subconscious is, it wants to take the path of least resistance. And when your prefrontal cortex is trying to reroute your brain to take a path of more resistance because you're having to fabricate something, your subconscious is going to be struggling with that. And so you're still going to have those indicators, even if you're a sociopath, because even a sociopath's brain is trying to take the path of least resistance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's a lot of structure and verbiage that we don't know that it needs to be changed. And so the lack of empathy very specifically doesn't address other things that you did during the day that now become out of sequence information. In the Delphi murder case, I just looked at Ron Logan, and he's asked a question about, can you walk down there from the bridge where they were at? And he says, that's not easy. No. That in the tense that he uses, he's pulling that from memory. And so his memory comes into his verbiage. And if you know what to look for, like past tense, when somebody asks you a hypothetical question, you should be speaking hypothetically. Like that looks like that would be difficult. You should be giving some version of a future tense as opposed to speaking in past tense. So tense is another thing that will give you away. And that's not something that a sociopath knows that they need to change. They're not going to automatically start talking in future tense simply because they don't feel empathy.
Yeah. So yeah, these indicators, they're not tied to emotion. So whether someone has emotion surrounding a certain situation or just has emotion in general isn't going to affect whether those indicators are there or not. Is
Yeah,
to
correct.
summarize.
Yep.
Okay, so Ovekin YT and Deanna 4851 both asked very similar questions. Essentially, would being under the influence, like drugs or alcohol, change your analysis regarding baseline or deception?
So that's a funny one. Actually, if you're drunk, it makes it much easier to tell if someone's being deceptive because their ability to control language becomes very sloppy. The biggest difficulty, I guess, with somebody who's drunk is that they don't have the mental stamina to undergo a lengthy interrogation. Most likely, if you get someone drunk and then you just start asking them very sensitive questions, eventually they'll just start telling you the truth on everything. Now, and being drunk is a spectrum, right? So if you've had a couple drinks, then it just becomes a little bit easier to see the indicators. If you've had way too many drinks, they're not going to be speaking in complete sentences. I would say the only time that you would have difficulty is if they're very drunk and they're purposefully not addressing your question. So at that point, it can be difficult to tell if they're just so trashed that they can't concentrate at all on anything that you're saying, or if they're trying to purposefully be evasive. But at that point, if you get somebody that's that drunk, keep asking them those hard questions because eventually they'll just tell you.
Okay, well, what about drugs? Are there different, like, I don't know. I remember, oh man, there was like a TV show way back when where they, I don't know how this is even legal, but they essentially like gave people all these different drugs. And then they're like, okay, move this fridge from, did you see that?
No, I haven't.
Well, the meth addict moved the fridge. He was very, very strong. And I think whoever was on coke also was pretty successful. But they essentially looked at these people on these drugs and they're like, okay, how do they handle this? Of course, the person who smoked weed was like, I'm not even gonna try. But are there different kinds of drugs that might impact someone's thought process or confidence, like cocaine or meth? I think it makes people more confident. Maybe they would be better at lying. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Honestly, I haven't baselined people who are high on various
Yeah.
drugs, so
Yeah.
I can't say how their speech patterns are going to be impacted. I mean, that would be interesting. I don't know if it would be ethical to to try it.
I don't know how this TV show was a thing. I swear I remember it as a child. I saw it on like some channel and I was like, okay. But I remember it. They had to move a fridge like up some stairs or maybe a ramp or something onto something else. So, viewers, audience, if you saw this and you want to point me in the direction of where this TV episode was, please, let me know. Let us all know. I'm very curious.
Yeah, I want to see it now. I mean,
yeah, it's a core memory. I don't know. Okay, well, yeah, how are you supposed to know you haven't interrogated people on a variety of drugs? And that makes complete sense.
yeah, very specifically when you're interrogating people, I mean, you don't want to interrogate them when they're drunk either. From the perspective of law enforcement, you're going to wait till they're sobered up. But if you want to find out if your spouse is cheating and they come home and they're high or they're drunk, ask them all of those tough questions and just see what responses you get. Usually they just break down and
Okay.
they're like, "Oh, the hell with it. Just tell you the truth and get you to stop asking me these questions."
Yeah, they're too drunk. They're too drunk to have a rational thought that this is probably something they should lie about.
Yeah.
Okay, actually, I'm going to go back to the last question we asked about sociopaths and emotions, because here's another, and this is similar to a question coming up as well, but I think there's a couple different ways to go at this. And so one is, okay, sociopaths. We've already discussed that. What about pathological liars? Or what about people who genuinely believe, maybe this is what a pathological liar is. I don't know. I haven't looked up the definition, but people who genuinely believe what they're saying, even though we can all say that they're wrong. We know they're wrong, but they believe it. How do you deal with that?
So it's different because they do believe what they're saying. However, if you baseline them, there's going to be a specific way that they lead into it. I call it a deception tag. My experience is that it's very easy to tell when a pathological liar is about to lie, especially because there's going to be something that triggers them. I guess I never was in a position where I had to analyze the verbiage because it's always so clear when they're lying that I never took the time to analyze the indicators.
Okay. Okay. So those are the questions where people tagged me crafty thinking, but there were a lot of questions that people didn't tag me on. I want to include them because they're all good questions. Here's one by Don't Dox Me 9. Asked, would you explain, actually kind of leads my last question leads into this very well. Would you explain what false positives are to deception detection, such as stress, depression, sadness, grief, guilt, nervousness, or anxiety? And it's similar to another question where they were asking about somebody with Tourette's. Specifically, that individual was like, well, you say saying I a lot is an indicator of deception. What about somebody with Tourette's? So, how would you handle this? You can address this in a few different ways or parts. It's a lot.
Someone with Tourette's, I mean, it's very clear when they have a tic. So
Yeah.
I don't know how you would describe this other than the tic doesn't mean anything. So it's kind of like somebody saying, I just remove that from the statement. I don't look at that as part of the baseline. I don't look at that as part of the deception. I just actually completely remove that from the statement. If I was looking at somebody with Tourette's, I would remove their tic from their statement because it's not relevant to the baseline or to anything. If there's going to be debate on this, it would be whether or not you can tell if somebody with Tourette's is saying something because it's a tic or not. So I've never interrogated somebody with Tourette's. I follow influencers that have Tourette's, and it seems very clear when they're ticking. I worked with a guy who had Tourette's, and there was never a question in my mind when something that he was saying was a tic. So I guess that's my answer to that.
No, I think that's a good answer.
Yeah, as far as the other ones, now a false positive. So I guess I have to answer this in a couple of different ways. There's no such thing as a false positive or a false negative for sadness, grief, guilt, nervousness, or anxiety.
Can you explain what a false positive and a false negative is?
I'm assuming that what they mean is that somebody uses an indicator of deception when they're not being deceptive.
Okay, yeah.
And I mean, I'm not sure, but that's what I'm assuming that they mean. So emotions are not going to give you false positives. So something like sadness, like I said, grief, guilt, nervousness, anxiety, those you can baseline. If somebody's on the stand and they're nervous and they're anxious, that's very normal. I would expect that, but I'm going to get their nervous, anxious baseline. Now, your baseline may change. Let's say I'm talking to you, but I'm talking to you off camera, just as friends. We're just talking about a subject. That baseline may be different than if I see you on the witness stand testifying about a murder. Oh, the last thing is depression is different. Depression is not an emotion. It's as a disorder. I am doing a lot of work now looking at how disorders actually change your verbiage to where some people use indicators and they're not being deceptive. But those are similar across all the people with that same disorder. So, for example, I was looking at the Meghan Markle interview with Oprah, and she's talking about depression to the point of suicide. And she uses a lot of negative statements in there. Too many. A person that uses that many negative statements, normally that would be a mild indicator of deception, but it would be an indicator of deception. So what I did is I started looking up people who had been diagnosed as being depressed or especially people who had committed. And in that video, I did put in some clips like from the lead singer of Linkin Park who committed. When he was talking to the press, his statements were loaded with negative statements. So there was no other indicators, just the negative statements. So it seems like if somebody has a mental disorder, that can affect the way that you talk. For example, using negative indicators or, things like ADHD. I found that people end up giving a lot more information after the yes, or their answers just tend to be longer. So I take that into consideration. Mm-hmm. Now, that's an interesting question. I just want to differentiate the difference between emotional states and actual disorders.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Yeah, that's a great answer. And I mean, a lot of what you're saying comes back to context, right? So you are going to look at the context that the person is in. You're not going to baseline somebody when they're hanging out in an ice cream shop and then use that baseline as what you're referencing when they're on the stand, giving a testimony in a trial and an attorney is questioning them. So it's like there is a broader analysis, but it is pinpointed to the individual person and has to be tailored to each person as well. And you take that into consideration. So That makes sense. Okay. The same individual asked another question. How does one go about being unbiased in their deception analysis?
Love of the game. It's hard to really get this point across because I think most people just don't believe it. But unless I know somebody personally, I couldn't care less whether that person is innocent or guilty. Every case that I go into, what's important to me is finding indicator. When I'm analyzing a statement, I don't want to sound like a psychopath here, but I don't care about the person. I don't care about the individual. When I started looking at Richard Allen, I knew that a lot of people had a lot of very strong feelings about whether he was innocent or guilty. But I didn't look at the evidence at all. I went in completely blind on his interrogation. And I'm just doing it because I want to use the skill that I have. So if he's innocent, I want to prove that he's innocent. And if he's guilty, I want to prove that he's guilty. So, the satisfaction in doing this for me has nothing to do with the individual. It's only to do with successfully using these tools. And I say this in my videos as well. If I was ever analyzing like a childhood hero, my childhood hero growing up was John Elway. I was a huge Denver Bronco fan. He was, the quarterback of the Broncos. I had posters of him in my room, him and Bon Jovi. Those were my two big idols. And I wouldn't analyze a statement from them because I wouldn't want to destroy a core memory. So I would just avoid that. And, that's how I avoid that.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a great answer. Okay. Okay. Christine Blanchard 9175 asked, Jen McCabe came off as being heavily coached on how/what to answer. Does that affect how you interpret baseline?
No, actually, that is why I baseline. I want to make a distinction, actually. There's a difference between knowing what you should be saying because you've been told what to say and actually saying it. The only thing that is going to help you on the stand is if you take a statement that is either generated by ChatGPT or a statement from a truthful person and memorize that verbatim. Because your brain cannot play a role in the process of giving your answer. If your brain plays a role, it's going to give you away. Let's say you and I make up a story. We rob a bank and we come up with this alternative story of where we were at. That's great. We've rehearsed this over and over and over again. Now, when I go into an interrogation, I'm going to give this story with 5,000 indicators. Just because I have a story rehearsed doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to actually say that story without indicators. So if you're a professional actor and you memorize a script, then yeah, you could actually come across without indicators. But that script would have to be written by somebody who thinks that they're writing the truth, for one.
I'm sorry, my cat has been making noise, and now he's like, I'll let him come say hi. Hello, Jack. This is Jack.
Oh man,
he's an 18-pound cat.
Wow.
It's short for Jaguar because he's a little panther. Nice. Now, please let me continue this conversation without interrupting me. I've been like looking over because he's making noise, and then he's sitting at my feet meowing because he wants me to pet him. So I'm very sorry. Continue.
We're about to get a cat, so I'm probably going to have the same issue starting in the very near future here.
Oh, what kind of cat?
We're looking at a Russian blue.
I want a Russian blue. They're like slightly hypoallergenic too. So is that why?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I would get one, but they are a little pricey. So I got a $20 cat that was abandoned at a pet store, and that's what Jack is.
Yeah, we're getting one from the shelter, but that's why we don't have it yet, because there was one, they had one and we wanted it, and when we got there, they had already given it to somebody else. So we're trying to wait for one.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. But anyways, you were talking about essentially how like an actor might be able to come up with a false story without there being deception tags because someone else wrote it. But if you are writing it, and then this is a little bit of my interpretation because I want to better understand what you're saying, but like, let's say you and I came up with like a false story, it wouldn't get rid of the deception tags because, I mean, we don't really know, I guess, our deception tags, which actually leads me to another question, which is, what if you did know your deception tags? Would a deception detective expert be really good at being deceptive?
Well, let's take these in order.
Don't want to put you on the spot, but
yeah, we'll take these in order here. So the thing about the coaching is you have to memorize a script that's either written by AI or written by somebody. Like you would literally have to tell somebody, write this. Like, I need a place where I went yesterday. Write me a story of a place where you went recently, so that they're writing it without indicators. And then you memorize it. Now, the problem with being on the stand or an interrogation booth is that you are only going to give that story right when you get to that story. And then usually what you'll see is a bunch of indicators leading right up to the rehearsed statement because they know the rehearsed statement is a lie.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, makes sense.
So yeah, the rehearsed statement
So
don't really help.
okay. So then what I said earlier is that you're like, if I wrote my own rehearsed statement, would I be able to get rid of, I mean, maybe I'd be able to get rid of some of the deception tags, right? Because like, I'm not going to write in I. Like, obviously, I'm not writing that down. But there might be very unique deception tags that only I have. And if I'm not aware of them, they may still show through my statement, correct?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So if you write out your statement, like if I get arrested and then they make me write out a statement, that would be a huge mistake on their part because I would think of the sentence that I want to write and then I would edit it and then I would write it without indicators. But
Okay.
I can't do that in real time. So there's a very, very accurate rule that goes along with this, which is the higher your IQ is, the worse you are at lying. So the people who,
I've never heard that.
yeah, because you have usually a better command of the English language, which means that that broca section is going to be stronger. And because it operates subconsciously, it really kills you. So
Interesting.
yeah, and then you find yourself over-analyzing, over-editing. One of the big things that I look for is called the 2-second rule. If it takes you longer than 2 seconds to answer a question, you're fabricating. So, and that's when you get hit with a direct accusation. Let me ask you a few questions.
Sure.
Do you have a cat?
Yes.
So that is information that's on the front of your mind. Any information at all that's on the front of your mind is going to be right there. If it takes you longer than 2 seconds to come up with information that's right in the front of your mind, then you're fabricating. And things like, did you kill someone last night? That's not something you're going to have to remember. But there are other indicators that show me that you're using memory. For example, 2 years ago, for your dad's birthday, what did you get him for a gift?
2 years ago, I don't know, but I know a year ago I got him. Well, his birthday is right after Christmas, so I got him a Christmas gift and a birthday gift. Always separate. You have to do that. I got him books, 2 books.
Okay. So actually, if I was doing this before you answered, I would have told you to stop. You don't just stop. I don't need the answer anymore because you opened your eyes and then you looked up and to the left and then, yeah, just like that. And that's all I need to know that you're accessing memory.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I've heard that before, but I've never really tested it on myself. Well, I guess we kind of got off on a tangent, so I guess I'll just go back to my question. One of my questions, which was, would a deception detection expert be really good at lying?
Oh, yeah. No.
Why? The IQ is just way too high?
I'd like to think that's the reason why, but for me, if I'm going to lie about something, I have to rehearse it over and over and over and over again because, well, for one thing, I am autistic. So rehearsing is just something I do anyways. Even if I have to do public speaking or whatever, even if I'm not going to lie, I have to rehearse a lot. But what happens is when I get into a situation where I start to lie, then I shut myself down because I realize that I just gave an indicator, even though, 99.99999% of people are not going to be able to hear the indicators in real time. As soon as I say something, I hear it. And then I'm like, and then I want to go back and say it the right way, but I'm like, no, that would look even more suspicious. And I can't even imagine what I look like to somebody who.
That's funny. Yeah. So you essentially, you know your own deception tags. You know the general deception tags, and when you're in a situation where you have to lie, you can pick out your deception tags, and then that makes you stumble because you're like, shit. And then you but no one else knows, but you know it. That's funny. That's interesting.
Yeah. Bottom line is people who are good at deception detection are not good at lying. They're usually going to trip up over their own acknowledgement of lies.
They know too much.
Yeah.
Okay, so Melanie Davenport, 4869, asked this. She says, do you think jurors have an instinct that sends a message of deception? And I think maybe I miswrote this. I think I might have miswrote it. Or I think I understand what this question is. Essentially, she's asking, do you think jurors have an instinct to know when somebody is being deceptive, even though they might not have the expertise that you have?
I don't think people are going to like this answer. I'm usually I usually go from being super popular because people want to talk to me about deception detection to becoming super unpopular when people don't like what I have to say. But most people think that they're very good at knowing when somebody's lying to them. And that's, I think, more like a personal pride thing. The reality is most people are very, very bad at knowing it. And there's a reason for it. It's because your brain can't process every word that you hear in real time. You have to follow someone's train of thought. As I start talking, you hear the words that I'm saying, but what you're doing is you're following my train of thought and you're actually anticipating the words that are going to come next. And as long as those words generally follow that you're going down the same path, you're not actually going to analyze the words. What you're going to do is you're just going to continue along, follow me down that path. And so people miss verbal indicators. I mean, people usually miss all verbal indicators, even though there's lots of them. And being a juror doesn't, they don't give you a handbook or superpowers. I think most jurors get duped by people who are lying, especially if they're confident when they're lying. I don't think that jurors are particularly good at picking out actual real indicators of deception.
Yeah, that would make sense. And I mean, similar to if you're in a situation where you are lying, it takes a lot of conscious effort. It's almost like if you are in a situation where you're trying to read if someone's lying or not, you're also putting in a lot of conscious effort to determine if they're lying. And the average person, it would be exhausting if every single day, I mean, in a juror situation, obviously, you might be looking at all the witnesses and trying to determine if they're lying or not. But I would say the average person isn't really looking for liars, and they aren't assuming people are lying. It's kind of an aggressive assumption, and it's an exhausting one.
Yeah, and I would say that most likely the jurors, if they are going to sit and scrutinize is every single word a lie, it's going to be when the defendant is on the stand. I don't think they actually I don't think they actually scrutinize the witnesses nearly as much as they do the actual defendant.
Yeah, that would make sense. Next question. Kit Carson 615 wants to know more about the words of just and really in deception. Is this just for Jennifer's baseline, or is it for anyone who uses those words?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I'll have to take those individually. So the word just, it has proper use in the English language. So just because somebody uses the word just doesn't mean necessarily that they're lying if they're using it correctly. So that's the first thing that you need to do, is to figure out how they're using it. The times when it is most likely being used as a lie is when a person is trying to eliminate other possibilities. So, for example, the Bryans were in the room, they were just talking. In that circumstance, she then continues to say that they were also, she actually can't get the words out, but she's trying desperately to insinuate that they were looking at a picture. So you can't be just talking if you're also looking at pictures. You've already narrowed that down, and now you're saying that they're doing other stuff. So in that instance, what the word just means is that it's not just deception in the fact that they were doing two things, but it's deceptive in the fact that she's trying very specifically to eliminate certain things. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I push back on that a little bit?
Yeah.
What about if you're already in a position of feeling defensive because somebody is attacking you, whether that person's correct or not? To me, it makes sense to clarify, but I feel like for me, I would kind of default say, I was just asking that because I'm just, I'm upset that somebody's making an allegation against me. And so that's my initial reaction. Maybe that's a specific baseline thing to me, but I don't think it's that unique.
So you bring up a very good and important point here, which is that the initial accusation is always different than continued follow-on accusations. And then if the accusation comes again, then you're going to see an escalation of anger. And you're going to see more definitive language. For example, at uncontracting denials. If somebody says, I didn't do it, and then the interrogator says, I don't believe you. I have a recording that says that you did it, that shows that you did it. What I would expect is now an uncontracted denial, which is, I did not do that. They're doubling down, and you're going to overemphasize things. So you are correct in that the word just in that circumstance, when the anger is escalating and you've already been truthful the first time, now you're going to overemphasize things. And the word just can be used to overemphasize.
Okay, that makes sense.
But
So then,
it's context related.
yeah, of course. Very, very related context, which is a lot. I mean, it's a big aspect of this, all of deception analysis, right? So, okay, then another part of that specific question was what about the term really?
Yeah, really is, off the top of my head, it's more often problematic than the word just, but there are times when you can use it truthfully. So, in an unprompted way, it's an extra word that tries to overemphasize something. And usually, when somebody is overemphasizing before they've been accused of something, that overemphasis is due to knowledge of guilt. And so, the words really and just, when they're used the wrong way, when they're used before real accusations have been compounded on you, then they're an indicator of knowledge of guilt. So some examples of this would be like, did you drink the last of the milk or something like that? And you say, well, I didn't really drink the last of the milk. So there's no way that you could work that word in there where it makes sense, right? So
Yeah.
I try and look at everything as being on a spectrum, because sometimes you need to take stuff to its logical extreme to understand if, in context, when you're thinking about a lot of other things at the same time, does that word actually mean something different? And it doesn't.
Mhm.
It still means the same thing as I didn't really drink all the milk. It's an unnecessary word. I don't know why people think it makes sense when they say it.
Okay. So then that means that in this situation, it is not just for Jennifer's baseline, but it's rather a more of a general thing that most people, it's part of their baseline. Maybe not everyone, but most.
Yeah. Again, yes, you have to look at their whole baseline. I can't think of any example where I've ever seen in someone's baseline where they overemphasize things that they say the first time they say it. But yeah, you have to look at their baseline, yeah.
Okay, so Steal More Crumbs asked, is baselining the reason it's easy to tell when someone you know really well is being truthful? Is it because you subconsciously have their baseline already just from knowing them so well?
Baselining is an active process. It is not a subconscious process. So just because you live with somebody doesn't mean that you've baselined them. So you have to actually have a conversation in which you don't tell them what you're doing. And you have to create a series of questions that's going to elicit certain answers. And then you have to listen to the verbiage and you have to remember that. And that's their baseline. Most people think that they have baselined people because they live with that person and they think that they know that person's mannerisms and speech. But in reality, what happens is you gain trust without actually a baseline, which makes it easier to be deceived because you think you know the baseline and you trust the person. And then when they start to lie to you, you don't see it because you don't know their baseline. And that's why you end up with a lot of people who say things like, I never saw this coming. I don't know how they could have been doing that for so long, and I didn't know about it. And the reason is because they thought that they knew that person's baseline, when in reality, baselining is a conscious process. You can't subconsciously baseline somebody just by being around them.
Okay, that's a good answer. Okay, something I find interesting about what you just talked about and kind of about this question is that, and I'm just kind of like really going off on a branch here, but is there like would you suggest, and you don't have to necessarily answer it if you're not comfortable with it, but would you suggest baselining in the initial stages of dating someone? Because I just realized, like, as you were talking, I essentially baselined my boyfriend in the initial stages of dating him. And I'm not, obviously, I don't have any of the expertise or the knowledge you have. So I wasn't sitting there like taking note and stuff. But I was asking certain easy questions and hard questions and really consciously analyzing his responses. And I was able to pick up when he was uncomfortable in certain situations and when he wasn't, like, whatever, when he was comfortable. And then I was able to continue to press on things where I noticed slight differences. Yet I didn't even know it was baseline blinding or anything like that. But I think it really helped me because I do know when I ask a question if my boyfriend's uncomfortable. And so I can either push on it or just leave it because there's some things that I don't like. If he was ever going to do a surprise birthday party for me, I'm not going to press on certain things because he's pretty bad at lying. I can tell every time. And so, but a big reason why I can tell, I think, is because the very beginning I was asking very hard questions and I was able to pick up when he was uncomfortable with something and when he wasn't. And I've just kind of used that as an analysis moving forward. So now I'm like, maybe everyone should baseline first dates.
100%. especially because you have to ask a bunch of questions without them knowing. And so
Mhm.
it's a lot easier to do that to a stranger. And it's expected in the beginning when you're getting to know someone, and that's a way of getting to know them. So it's like, it's okay. Now,
Yeah.
if you've been with someone for 10 years and you sit down and you start to baseline them, you're asking them questions when you have the intent of baselining and they don't know what you're doing, it's a little more, I don't know if that falls into the category of ethics here. Like, is it ethical to?
Manipulative?
Yeah, it's manipulative. It is manipulative. And so
It is. It is.
yeah, and so I highly, highly recommend baselining everyone you meet the first time you meet them, because
Mhm.
then it's done, it's out of the way, you know that person. Now, here's an interesting thing is I have a bit of a reputation amongst my wife's friends for doing that. And so they'll, when they start dating someone, they'll often invite us to double dates. And then with the intention of just having me baseline that guy for them. And you want to know the funniest thing is that I do that, and then I will tell them exactly this is how this guy is, this is what's important to him, this is what's not, whatever. And it doesn't really matter what the analysis is. It's usually bad. And it doesn't seem to prevent them from just continuing with the relationship. And then a year or two later, having that conversation with wine and cheese in our living room at like 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, where she comes over and the three of us now, because the boyfriend's not in the picture anymore,
Yeah.
are sitting there and we inevitably have the same conversation every time. Man, you really saw all this coming. And I'm like, yeah. And I told you, it's really surprisingly not that difficult to baseline people once you know what to look for. The hard
Mhm.
part is to be honest about the results that you get back.
Right. Just trusting the process. You just have to trust the process and be like, you know what? I know that something great is going to come of this, even if I say no to this potential pathway. Because those red flags in the beginning, if you're seeing them now, it's going to get a billion times worse 6 months, 1 year, 5 years down the line.
Yep.
But yeah.
100%.
Anyways, okay. Well, you should do a dating series on like how women should, and I can advise and help you with that since obviously I have like the experience in that. I mean, you can do it for men too, but it's a bigger threat to women actually because
It is, yeah.
like physical aspect of it and all of that. But I think that would be a good thing. Okay, then last question is a question for me. Not that I haven't been asking you a ton of questions, but have you ever been a juror? And do you think your expertise would cause a lawyer to immediately dismiss you?
I have been summoned for jury duty, but I've never actually gone. So when I get the summons in the mail, it says to respond if you're whatever. There's like some questions on there. And I was always a federal agent before. So I wrote that I was a federal agent and I would send it back and I didn't hear from them again. So I'm assuming it was okay. Maybe I just no showed. I don't know. But now that I'm retired, if I get summoned again for jury duty, I would definitely go and see what happens. Because
Yeah.
I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I would definitely tell them, hey, I'm a YouTuber. I'm expert in deception detection. That's what I do. And I'm happy to be a juror if you want me here, and just see what they say.
Watch one of the lawyers be like, no, you're dismissed. But then they like contact you and like, yeah, but can I hire you?
Yeah, if somebody knew that, wow, this guy really knows what he's doing, I don't want him here, then I think that says something about their clients.
Yeah, that's concerning and it's on its own. Okay, well, those were all the questions from your most recent video. Again, it was day 7 pre-lunch looking at Jennifer McCabe for the Karen Reed trial. We plan on continuing to do this, after lunch and day 8 as well. So stay tuned for all of that. Is there anything else you want to say to the audience?
Thanks for watching.
Yeah, thank you for watching and we'll see you next time.